Hello, today we have some questions on the fermentation process and what food that I made. So I made sauerkraut. I think it could have sat a little longer. It's not as brown as I thought it would be. Um, I'm a little afraid to try it now that I know what fermentation is and how it's done. So I'm not going to try it. But it wasn't hard, and I looked up a lot of recipes. I decided between kimchi or this or kombucha because I like kombucha, but I want something simple because I feel like all the other ones had a lot of steps and I would have kind of lost focus on what this was actually about. So, sauerkraut. I shredded some cabbage, and the recipe said to shred the cabbage and then you measure it and you put so many teaspoons of salt to however many pounds the cabbage was. So I did that, and it says to let it sit for like 2 weeks. This has sat for just about a week, maybe a little over a week. And it still kind of has its color. It's not quite orangey brown yet, but yeah, this is my food, and I do like sauerkraut, but I'm not eating this. So the questions are, what microbes are involved in this process? So these microbes in sauerkraut are going to be the lactic acid bacteria. It's not yeast, it's nothing like that. It's lactic acid bacteria. And I looked this up on researchgate.net. I wanted to know the exact bacteria. It is leuconostatic mesenteroids. And it initiates the lactic acid fermentation start. So it's the one that is kind of like the catalyst. It gets everything going. And it's different because it can tolerate high levels of salt and sugar. So I put a ton of salt in this, so that makes sense. The next question is, what is the purpose of adding the ingredients to your recipe? So I added the salt because the salt is supposed to suck out all the water that's in there, and it's also supposed to kind of penetrate, and you let it sit in there, and that's how it starts to grow the bacteria, is just by that salt and liquid and cabbage combination. Most bacteria don't like all that salt, so it kind of pushes away any other bacteria that's not wanted. And I know that, but I'm still not going to eat it. But yeah, it kind of pushes away any bad bacteria, and it lets this specific salty one grow. Number 3 is, what metabolic processes are the microbes undergoing? So during fermentation, we have to undergo glycolysis. And so that's that whole thing with the separation with the NADH and the NAD plus and NADH, and then giving off the 2 ATP, and then the 2 ADP as well. And then at the end, we go into the 2 lactates and the pyruvates. So that's kind of the metabolic pathway of what's actually happening. We have to go through glycolysis, and that's what the bacteria are doing. Like in the video, it mentioned the bacteria has to eat the sugar, so that's kind of the glycolysis happening. And then it produces lactic acid. Number 4, what changes occurred in your food during this? Okay, all the amounts. So it's supposed to turn in more of a brownish color. So that's what's supposed to happen, kind of be like these darker ones in here. So that happened, and I think that's because the lack of oxygen. So I think the oxygen level is going lower because the bacteria and the glycolysis process is using some of that oxygen. So I think the O2 is less, and it's also an anaerobic process, so it's not really going to happen if there's too much oxygen. I think the CO2 is building up because, again, that's what happens. The CO2 accumulates in fermentation. And the pH is definitely lower, so it probably identifies on the lower end of the scale because the acidity is growing. The alcohol, I think that I watched the videos, but I think the alcohol would be less because it evaporates. But I could be wrong. But I think there's less alcohol in here than when it would start. And the temperature, usually during fermentation, we use inoculation for some things, but with fermentation, heat is usually given off. I don't feel any heat. It doesn't need heat to ferment, so I don't think the temperature is changing, but I know that that can happen. So that's how I'm going to answer that. Were you successful making your food? Well, obviously not, since it did not change colors as much as I want. But technically, I can just let it sit longer. And then, what changes would you make if you were to make that food again? I would put a little more salt. I'd cover it better, use a smaller jar, and yeah, more salt, smaller jar, and cover it a little better. So yeah, thank you so much for this class and for all the knowledge. Thank you.